After Khrushchev's fall in 1964, the Soviet Union turned to a new leader, Leonid Brezhnev. But Brezhnev inherited the same fundamental problem that had haunted Khrushchev and even Stalin before him. The Soviet economy was failing, and no political leader could admit why. Brezhnev and his advisors recognized that the Soviet economy was struggling and could not continue operating as it had for decades. Factories were inefficient, production targets were often unrealistic, and the rigid system of central planning left little room for innovation or flexibility. To address these growing problems, the Soviet leadership proposed a series of modest economic reforms. These reforms were not intended to dismantle socialism or challenge communist rule. Instead, they aimed to introduce small elements of market logic into the command economy while preserving the existing political system. The reformers hoped that factory managers would be given greater authority to make decisions about production and operations. They encouraged planners and managers to pay more attention to supply and demand and considered allowing prices to reflect economic realities rather than being determined entirely by government officials. They also sought to improve efficiency by spreading information, sharing successful practices, and rewarding better performance. In essence, Brezhnev's advisors believed that a limited dose of market principles could make the Soviet economy work more effectively without threatening the Communist Party's monopoly on power. However, this goal quickly ran into a fundamental problem. Economic reform in a centrally planned system could not be separated from politics. Once factory managers were given more authority, questions immediately emerged about who actually had the power to make decisions. If prices and production were to reflect market conditions, who would judge whether those decisions were successful? If information about shortages, inefficiency, or poor management became important for reform, who would control that information? And what would happen when a factory's economically sensible decision conflicted with orders from the state? Brezhnev insisted that political authority remain untouched. Public criticism of the government was discouraged, and meaningful debate about the political system was off limits. Yet the very reforms designed to improve the economy inevitably challenged the political structures that controlled it. A command economy depended on centralized authority, and any effort to decentralize economic decision-making raised questions about that authority. As a result, the reforms stalled. Like Khrushchev before him, Brezhnev discovered that it was impossible to reform the Soviet economy in a significant way, without also confronting the political system that governed it. The leadership wanted the benefits of economic flexibility without political change, but the two issues were inseparable. Consequently, the reforms achieved little, and the deeper problems of the Soviet economy remained unresolved. In 1968, Czechoslovakia became the center of one of the greatest challenges to Soviet authority in Eastern Europe. Under the leadership of reform-minded communists, the country launched a program of political and economic liberalization that became known as the Prague Spring. The movement reflected growing frustration with the rigidities of Soviet-style communism and a desire to create a more open and responsive society. Reformers in Czechoslovakia openly criticized the failures of the communist system and called for significant changes. They demanded greater freedom of expression, encouraged public debate, and proposed economic reforms designed to make the economy more efficient and responsive to people's needs. Their goal was not to abolish socialism, but to create what they described as socialism with a human face, a system that would preserve socialist principles while allowing greater personal freedom and political participation. At first, Brezhnev and the Soviet leadership attempted to resolve the crisis through negotiations. However, the reforms continued to expand, and Soviet officials grew increasingly alarmed. The more freedom the Czechs gained, the more Moscow feared that Czechoslovakia might slip out of its sphere of influence and inspire similar movements across Eastern Europe. In August 1968, Brezhnev decided to act. Soviet troops, supported by forces from several Warsaw Pact nations, invaded Czechoslovakia and brought the Prague Spring to an abrupt end. The reform movement was suppressed, its leaders were removed from power, and political controls were reimposed. The invasion sent a powerful message throughout the communist world. First, it demonstrated that economic and market-oriented reforms could quickly lead to demands for broader political freedoms, making them a potential threat to communist rule. Second, it showed that the Soviet Union was willing to use military force to prevent any Eastern European satellite state from pursuing a path independent of Moscow. The lessons Brezhnev drew from the Prague Spring were clear. Rather than encouraging further experimentation, the crisis convinced him that reform was too dangerous. As a result, the Soviet leadership largely abandoned meaningful economic reform and returned to a policy of stability, control, and political conformity, a decision that contributed to the long period of economic stagnation that followed. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union and its Eastern European allies were facing a growing economic crisis. Decades of centralized planning had produced impressive industrial growth in earlier years, but the system was now showing clear signs of stagnation. Factories relied on outdated machinery, consumer goods were often poorly made, productivity was declining, and corruption had become deeply embedded throughout the bureaucracy. Ordinary citizens endured chronic shortages of basic products, and governments across the Eastern Bloc struggled to find a solution. Having rejected meaningful economic reforms after the Prague Spring, Eastern European leaders searched for another way to revive their economies. Their opportunity appeared during the period of détente in the early 1970s. As tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union eased, trade and diplomatic contacts expanded. For the first time, communist countries gained broader access to Western banks, credit markets, and investment capital. To many leaders in Eastern Europe, this seemed like the perfect answer to their economic problems. Instead of restructuring their inefficient economies, they believed they could borrow money from the West and use those funds to modernize existing industries. The strategy appeared straightforward. Governments would secure loans from Western banks, invest the money in new technology and factory equipment, increase the quality and quantity of production, and then sell those improved goods in Western markets. The profits from these exports would not only stimulate economic growth, but also provide the revenue needed to repay the loans. On paper, the plan looked brilliant. It promised modernization without political reform and economic growth without abandoning socialism. Eastern European governments could preserve their communist systems while benefiting from Western capital and technology. In practice, however, the strategy failed. The underlying weaknesses of the centrally planned economies remained unchanged. New loans could not solve problems such as inefficient management, poor incentives, bureaucratic decision-making, and limited innovation. Factories often struggled to produce goods that Western consumers actually wanted to buy. Exports failed to grow quickly enough, and the expected profits never materialized. As debts mounted throughout the 1970s, many Eastern European governments found themselves trapped. Instead of borrowing money to finance growth, they increasingly borrowed money simply to repay earlier loans and cover existing obligations. What had begun as a hopeful modernization strategy gradually turned into a dangerous cycle of dependence on foreign credit. By the end of the decade, the dream of using Western loans to rescue communist economies had largely collapsed. The debts remained, the economic inefficiencies persisted, and the financial crisis that followed would contribute significantly to the growing instability of the Eastern Bloc in the years leading up to the collapse of Soviet communism. The strategy soon unraveled because it failed to address the fundamental weaknesses of the communist economic system. Eastern European leaders had hoped that Western loans and modern technology would revitalize their industries, but the underlying problems of central planning remained unchanged. Factories that had long operated according to government production quotas struggled to compete in international markets. Many of their products simply could not meet the quality standards expected by Western consumers. The system also provided little incentive for innovation or improvement. Factory managers were rewarded for meeting production targets established by government planners, not for developing better products or responding to consumer demand. Workers faced a similar problem. Because wages and promotions were rarely tied to productivity or performance, there was little motivation to work harder or increase efficiency. As a result, many factories continued operating much as they always had, despite the influx of Western capital. Corruption made the situation even worse. Throughout the communist bureaucracy, party officials often diverted or misused funds that had been intended for modernization projects. Money that was supposed to purchase new equipment, improve infrastructure, or increase productivity frequently disappeared into inefficient government programs or the hands of well-connected officials. Instead of strengthening the economy, many loans added to existing problems. By the late 1970s, Eastern Europe faced a crisis that was far worse than the one leaders had hoped to solve. The region's economies remained inefficient and uncompetitive, producing goods that struggled to find buyers in Western markets. At the same time, governments had accumulated enormous debts from years of borrowing. The expected profits from exports never materialized, leaving many countries with few resources to repay what they owed. As debt payments grew and economic conditions deteriorated, governments found themselves trapped. They lacked the economic growth needed to generate revenue, yet creditors still expected repayment. What had seemed like a path toward modernization had instead produced a dangerous cycle of debt and stagnation. No country felt these pressures more intensely than Poland. Burdened by rising debt, persistent shortages, and growing public frustration, Poland became the first major flashpoint of the economic and political crisis that would eventually shake the entire Soviet bloc. Soon, the failures of communist economic policy would spark a movement that challenged not only Poland's government, but also Soviet authority throughout Eastern Europe. Out of Poland's deepening economic crisis emerged the first independent trade union in the Soviet bloc, Solidarity. The movement began in 1980 at the Gdańsk shipyards, where rising prices, worsening shortages, and years of economic mismanagement had fueled growing worker dissatisfaction. Led by Lech Wałęsa, an electrician and labor activist, Solidarity quickly grew beyond a traditional trade union and became a powerful force for social and political change. What made Solidarity remarkable was that it challenged communist authority while remaining legal, at least initially. The movement gave workers a voice independent of the Communist Party and soon attracted support from intellectuals, religious leaders, and ordinary citizens across Poland. Solidarity demanded not only better wages and working conditions, but also greater political freedoms, respect for civil rights, and accountability from the government. The organization's rapid growth demonstrated the depth of public frustration with the communist system. Within a short time, Solidarity had nearly 10 million members, representing almost one-third of Poland's population. No opposition movement of this size had ever existed within the Soviet bloc. Its success showed that large numbers of people were willing to organize outside the structures controlled by the Communist Party. Lech Wałęsa became the public face of the movement and an international symbol of peaceful resistance. His leadership earned widespread admiration abroad, and he was later awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to promote workers' rights and political reform through non-violent means. In Western countries, Solidarity was celebrated as evidence that ordinary people could challenge authoritarian rule. More importantly, Solidarity represented a turning point in the history of Eastern Europe. The economic failures of the 1970s had weakened confidence in communist governments and exposed the limits of their ability to deliver prosperity. Solidarity transformed that dissatisfaction into organized action. It showed that resistance to Soviet-style rule was not only possible, but could attract mass support. In this sense, Solidarity marked the beginning of the end of Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe. The economic crises of the 1970s created the conditions for opposition to emerge. Solidarity made that opposition visible, organized, and impossible to ignore. The movement inspired reformers throughout the Soviet bloc and helped pave the way for the dramatic political changes that would sweep across Eastern Europe in the late 1980s.